The shocking roots of climate change hysteria.
Mr. Reagan.
All right, before we start, I've got a great new sponsor for the show, Gold Co. If you want to diversify your portfolio, protect your savings, safeguard your retirement, try investing in gold with Gold Co. Go to MrReaganLikesGold.com or call 844-696-GOLD or click on the link in the description below. Most of us think, as I did, that the modern environmental movement in America, what eventually evolved into the current climate change hysteria, began in 1962 with the publication of the book Silent Spring. And that is kind of true. But actually, climate change hysteria is really a continuation of another paranoia that started over 200 years ago in the late 18th century, and it grew into a serious movement, gaining momentum right up to the 1960s. And although you have probably never heard of it, it carries on even to this very day. So what is this proto-hysteria of which I speak? Well, academics and wealthy elites became obsessed with the idea that humanity was overbreeding, that we were going to procreate ourselves into extinction. They believed that there were too many people and that soon we would completely run out of food. They were convinced that the world would soon descend into chaos. I call this phenomenon overpopulation hysteria. And as I said, this hysteria still persists. And it kind of makes sense. The Earth is finite, with finite resources. We may not know exactly what the limit is, but if the population keeps growing indefinitely, we will eventually find out. But the Earth is vast, and sometimes people underestimate just how vast. And so the reason I refer to concerns over overpopulation as a hysteria is because the dire predictions around it have been proven wrong time and time again. Harrison Brown in 1954 predicted civilizational collapse by the end of the 1950s or 60s. Obviously, this did not happen. William and Paul Paddock in 1967 predicted global famines by 1975. Obviously, this did not happen. Paul Ehrlich in 1968 predicted mass starvation of hundreds of millions in the 1970s and 80s. Obviously, this did not happen. The Club of Rome in 1972 predicted total resource depletion or severe scarcity of gold, mercury, silver, tin, zinc, oil, natural gas, copper, and lead by the year 2000. Obviously, this did not happen. But these failed predictions did not deter the overpopulation alarmists. To those who believed, advocated, and acted upon overpopulation hysteria, this was not just a theory, it was a religion. Politicians, bureaucrats, and so-called experts truly believed that unless population growth was stopped, we were all going to die. Overpopulation hysteria reached its peak in the late 1960s after a guy named Paul Ehrlich published his book, The Population Bomb, in 1968. In one interview, Ehrlich discusses ways to reduce the population. His primary solution? Manipulate public opinion. He wanted the federal government to publicly promote the value of small families and to publicly shame large families. Full-on propaganda to change the values of the American people. His ultimate solution, and this is completely insane, government regulation of family size.
Given the population explosion, what ought the government to do about this?
So the first thing that should happen is that the president ought to say, from here on out, no intelligent, patriotic American family ought to have more than 2 children, preferably 1, if you're starting a family now. Not any law, but just say this is what responsible people do. He ought to make the FCC see to it that large families are always treated in a negative light on television wherever they appear. There ought to be a tremendous amount of television time devoted to spot commercials, the sort we've had against smoking. You get a scene which shows Los Angeles in the smog and it just says this city has a fatal disease. It's called overpopulation. And so long. You could move to giving women bonuses for not having babies. That almost certainly would do the job. Then you could move to changing the tax structure. People who had the money and had the children paid for the children. In other words, you would increase taxes on people with children. If that doesn't work, then you'll have the government legislating the size of the family. And people say, oh, that's impossible. Government can never intrude and tell you how many children to have. Well, I got news. You know, it intruded a long time ago and told you how many wives you can have. And there's not the slightest question that if we don't get the population under control with voluntary means, that in the not too distant future, the government will simply tell you how many children you can have and throw you in jail if you have too many.
And this was not merely academic theory. This was a coordinated effort to reduce population growth in the U.S. by any means necessary. And I feel like it worked. The U.S. birth rate has been steadily declining since about 1960, and internationally, the efforts for population control have been even more extreme. Mass abortions, forced sterilizations, China's one-child policy, even letting millions starve during famines. Yeah, that's a real thing. During the 1943 Bengal famine, British colonial administrators referenced Malthusian principles to downplay intervention, allowing millions of Indians to starve to death. William and Paul Paddock argued to permit starvation in their 1967 book, and Paul Ehrlich also argued for this in 1968. This eugenicist tactic was promoted well into the 1970s. And look into India's sterilization campaigns in the 1970s, funded by the World Bank and advised by American NGOs. This all sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory, but this is all shockingly real. And as I said, this obsession with population control is still here today. It's just been rebranded. Back then, it was overpopulation. Today, it's climate change. And climate change was kind of a funny tactic at first. Initially, in the 1970s, they said we were all going to freeze to death in the coming ice age. Then in the 1980s, we were all going to burn to death because of global warming. And now, climate change, a nice, safe, vague term, so that whatever happens, drought, rain, heat waves, freezing cold, snowstorms, hurricanes, you name it, they can say, see, climate change. And this tactic of shifting fear narratives, it's not new. In fact, some of you might remember back in the 1970s and 80s, the mainstream media was constantly warning us that we're going to run out of fossil fuels within 50 years.
One of the groups involved in the CSIRO forum was the Australian Association for the Study of Peak Oil and Gas. It believes that the planet's oil production will peak in a couple of years and start going into decline.
This was everywhere. Scientists and journalists were all running around screaming that we were going to hit peak oil and that humanity was going to face a catastrophic energy crisis by the early 20th century. But just like with overpopulation hysteria, they made one critical mistake. They failed to account for technological advancement. Just as the Green Revolution completely transformed agriculture and prevented the mass famines that the overpopulation doomsayers were hyperventilating over, technological breakthroughs in energy completely destroyed the fossil fuel depletion narrative. We developed new technologies like fracking, horizontal drilling, and exploiting oil sands. These innovations unlocked massive new reserves of oil and natural gas, reserves that were previously thought to be completely inaccessible. And so then, guess what? The supposed fossil fuel shortage never happened. But people are not rational. Even though the fear of running out of fossil fuels faded, the global elites never stopped their hyperventilating panic. Instead, they conveniently pivoted to a new justification for restricting fossil fuel use: climate change. Now think about that for a second. The solution to the so-called climate crisis just happens to be, what a coincidence, a massive reduction in fossil fuel consumption. It's almost like the entire climate change movement was a bait and switch. It's almost like the real motivation wasn't about the environment at all. It's almost like it's been about overpopulation the whole time. And look, I think these alarmists, they truly believed that we were going to run out of fossil fuels back in the 1980s. So you know what? Okay, fine. I get it. I understand that a little deception felt justified. They thought that they needed to nudge the public into consuming less. They wanted to save humanity. But the predicted shortages never really materialized. The fear narrative is now obsolete. So you know what, guys? Maybe stop lying. Your little ruse, it's no longer necessary. But you know what? They just keep going. Because as I said, it's no longer just a theory. It is a religion. Consider that they always claim that they're just following the science. But the science has only ever just been an effort to justify their real motivations. What this is really all about is finding the most emotionally effective weapon to push population control. Overpopulation was concerning. The next ice age was alarming. But both of these things, I think they seemed a little too sci-fi. They didn't really justify population control efforts in the minds of good Christians throughout the United States and Europe. But global warming, crops failing, forests eviscerated, polar bears dying, sea levels rising, cities underwater, that scared the hell out of people. And so the narrative changed. Not because the science changed, but because the fear tactic changed. The narrative does not follow the science. The science follows their narrative. And the effects of this overpopulation hysteria, now rebranded as climate change, have been absolutely devastating in a variety of ways. In fact, I think it may have even been as devastating as communism. I believe that overpopulation hysteria can be linked to not just birth rate decline throughout Western civilization, but also war, famine, the feminist movement, and the rise in the popularity of homosexuality and transgenderism. I'll explain all of this in one moment. First, of course, I have to talk about my amazing sponsor. Do you ever feel like your body's stress switch is permanently stuck in the on position, like you can't shut your mind off at night? That was me, seriously. But then I discovered what was really happening. It wasn't just stress, it was a magnesium deficiency. That's when I discovered Magnesium Breakthrough from Bioptimizers. This changed everything. Within days of taking it, I noticed I was falling asleep faster, waking up refreshed, and I was handling daily stress much better. What makes Magnesium Breakthrough different? Well, most supplements, they only contain one or two types of magnesium. Magnesium Breakthrough delivers all 7 forms that your body needs, all in one capsule. And this balances your stress response and supports your sleep quality. The results speak for themselves. Over 1,500 5-star reviews from people who have reclaimed their calm, their sleep, their energy. And right now, you can save 10% when you go to bioptimizers.com/Mr. Reagan and use code Mr. Reagan. They even offer a full 365-day guarantee, so there's zero risk to try it. Don't just manage stress, break through it with Magnesium Breakthrough. Again, that's bioptimizers.com/Mr. Reagan and use the code Mr. Reagan. And if you subscribe, not only will you get amazing discounts and free gifts, you will make sure that your monthly supply is guaranteed. So I already went over the history of overpopulation hysteria in my video about the EU legalizing mealworms in food, but nobody watched that video, so I'm going to go over it again here briefly. Overpopulation concerns were first raised in Thomas Malthus's 1798 work, An Essay on the Principle of Population. Overpopulation hysteria has been ruminating among academics in the upper echelon of Western civilization for over 200 years. Crazy. But these ideas really gained traction in the 19th century and really surged in the 20th century, especially between the 1940s and the 1960s. This was after World War II and was probably because of economic and environmental anxieties. The eugenics movement emerged with the rise in popularity of social Darwinism, and after the works of Francis Galton on hereditary improvement were published in the 1880s. And so, overpopulation hysteria and the eugenics movement each amplified the other. There was a problem and there was a solution. Overpopulation hysteria reached its peak in the late 1960s and 70s after the publication of Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb in 1968. Rachel Carlson's book Silent Spring was published in 1962, igniting the modern environmental movement, as we discussed at the top of the show. And this really set the stage for the overpopulation hysteria to transition to climate hysteria. As Western civilization abandoned the Christian faith and turned more and more to atheism, people became lost. They no longer took seriously the idea that they had a duty to God. They no longer followed any strict set of moral principles, and they lost their sense of purpose. And so people felt a compulsion to fill that emptiness with a new purpose, a new religion. And saving the planet was perfectly positioned to become that new religion. But before that, because everyone was in a panic about overpopulation, a number of organizations had formed to combat this perceived global catastrophe. And again, this sounds like crazy conspiracy theory fiction, but this is all real. Planned Parenthood, the UN Fund for Population Activities, Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, Population Council, the Club of Rome, and get this, USAID. These were all founded to address fears about overpopulation. Also, the Gates Foundation, the WHO, the IMF, and the World Bank all eventually became involved in reducing the world population as well.
This is a map of the development of international Planned Parenthood. So you'll see it started with the American Birth Control League, Birth Control Federation of America. Here you have Carola Warburg Rothschild. Here's Margaret Sanger, who was a part of all of them. By the 1950s, other organizations are starting to get involved, particularly the UN. What was created, particularly looking at the population issue, was something called the Draper Committee. USAID is formed as a result of the Draper Committee. These are people who are industrialists, are high-ranking military officials, are part of Skull and Bones. You have other people who were part of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Atlantic Institution, members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Monsanto Chemical Corporations, the Brookings Institutions, people who were a part of NATO. This is the military-industrial complex. We're also part of International Planned Parenthood and the Population Crisis Committee. This is a eugenics society.
The primary strategy for resolving the overpopulation issue has been to reduce population growth, and that means stopping people from having kids. And some methods for doing this have been drastic. Not only that, but many of these organizations have accumulated a lot of power, way more than you might expect. And we have seen the stuff that Doge has been uncovering lately. And so basically, a lot of these NGOs, nonprofit organizations that get money from like USAID, they've essentially been turned into grift machines and money laundering operations. They just redirect US tax money into the pockets of corrupt politicians and bureaucrats. And of course, they're still trying to reduce the population. But domestically in the US, I actually think that the most effective method by which they were able to reduce the population was cultural. It was from Hollywood. For a while there in the 1990s, just about every movie directly used climate change in their plot or directly cited it in some way. But at the same time, they were indirectly trying to manipulate people to stop having kids. Before the 1990s, big families were fairly typical in films and movies. Think about The Sound of Music, The Brady Bunch, The Waltons, 8 is Enough, Little House on the Prairie. I looked up big families on TV in the 90s, and there were a few. The biggest was from a show called Seventh Heaven. But family sizes were definitely trending down by the 1990s. And so now I did some research on TV shows today, and get this, in 2025, aside from reality shows, there are 0 large families on television. Now, there is apparently one sitcom on Netflix called The Upshaws. This is about a black family with 4 kids. That's about it. Today, cool characters in Hollywood films or TV shows, they rarely have any siblings or children. Parents with kids are often depicted as miserable, whilst childless couples are romanticized. And this Hollywood propaganda has been extremely effective. As I said before, the US birth rate has been steadily declining since 1960. But Hollywood's attempt to terrorize the world into halting procreation started far earlier, particularly in the science fiction of the 1960s and 1970s. Take Soylent Green, for example. This dystopian classic imagines a future where Earth is so overcrowded and resources are so depleted that people are literally being turned into food. The line, "Soylent Green is people," became one of the most famous lines in film history, and it was directly inspired by overpopulation hysteria.
Listen to me, Hatcher. You gotta tell them Soylent Green is people! We gotta stop them somehow!
And then you had Logan's Run, where anyone over the age of 30 was executed in order to preserve resources.
When this turns to black, that's it. But if for some strange reason you want to be 31, then you have the same chance as everyone else.
Or THX 1138. This was George Lucas's dystopian film where reproduction was completely controlled by the state.
What's wrong?
I need something stronger.
Take 4 red capsules. In 10 minutes, take 2 more. Help is on the way.
Even Blade Runner takes place in a world ravaged by environmental decay and overpopulation. The Mad Max films, Waterworld, The Day After Tomorrow, Elysium, Snowpiercer, The Book of Eli, Interstellar, all of these take place in a dystopian future caused by overpopulation, resource depletion, or climate change. And you know what? I actually love some of these films. Certainly, some of these stories, they're simply using overpopulation or resource depletion or climate change as a convenient plot device, copying it maybe from other authors. Overpopulation or resource depletion are even things that I can imagine writing into some of my own stories. But when you get to the root of this overpopulation plot device, it's always influenced by real overpopulation alarmists. It always stems from real warnings and real fears. So whether the screenwriters and directors and producers intended it or not, these films are not just entertainment. They are propaganda. Hollywood has been indoctrinating audiences with the idea that too many people equals death and suffering for decades. They have been conditioning us all to believe that humanity itself is the disease. Now, all of this sounds pretty horrific, but as I indicated before, I don't necessarily think the intentions of the global elites for the past 200 years or so, I don't think it was actually bad. If you really believe that overpopulation will extinguish humanity, well then it's actually valiant to try to fix the problem. But this is where things get really dark. When people become myopically fixated on a single all-important goal, a goal they believe is the most important aim in the history of the planet, and they believe that to such a degree that their entire identity becomes totally defined by striving to achieve this goal, well then they can very quickly adopt the ends justify the means mentality. And when that happens, a myriad of sins become entirely justified in the mind of this kind of person. In the case of curtailing population growth, this justifies things that would normally be perceived by regular people as horrific. It justifies eugenics. It justifies famine. It justifies war. It even justifies genocide. If you are convinced that the world is going to end in 12 years from the overconsumption of resources due to overpopulation and climate change, war is not a tragedy. It's a benefit.
The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change.
If you believe that humanity will go extinct if overpopulation is not curtailed, then this excuses crimes against humanity. War and genocide are not only excusable, they are desirable. The military-industrial complex and war profiteering are no longer ethically concerning. They are completely moral. And look, I'm not suggesting that wars have been started or prolonged purely because of a desire within the political or bureaucratic class to reduce the world population. But if you are making money via the military-industrial complex, or if you have some other incentive to start a war or facilitate the extension of a war for years, population control, well, it becomes a very tempting justification. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, prolonged wars, prolonged death, prolonged profit. And particularly sick individuals may even justify sex trafficking and even crimes against children. Because if you destroy the mind of a woman or a child and you traumatize them to such a degree that they will live the rest of their life with a mental illness, they may never be able to develop healthy romantic relationships. In such cases, they might never have children, and they may even end their own existence on this planet. These things are considered horrifying to normal people, those who have a healthy philosophical outlook, those with old-fashioned Christian values. But to those who believe that the ultimate goal is population control, these things are all completely justified. And look, we know this stuff is happening. We know there is a list of clients who avail themselves of the services of one Jeffrey Epstein. We just don't know who they are. We don't yet have the list. But we know they're out there, and we know what they did. And many people hear about these horrific crimes and they say, how can anyone justify creating such a business? How can intelligence agencies use young girls in such a way as a tool to blackmail important people? How can entire organizations made up of dozens or hundreds or even thousands of people engage in such inhumane behavior? Well, those involved, they tell themselves that it's for the greater good. The ends, they reason, justify the means. And maybe the overpopulation crisis is one of those justifications. But these are the mental gymnastics of the top-tier lunatics, the most twisted, the most deranged among us. I think overpopulation hysteria has infected the broader culture in absolutely devastating ways as well. Modern feminism, which initially fought for equal rights, has since been twisted into a powerful anti-motherhood ideology. Young women are encouraged to delay or forego motherhood entirely in order to pursue endless education, advanced degrees, and prestigious careers at soulless corporations. Clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson and others have observed a heartbreaking trend. Many women, by the time they reach their 40s, experience a deep, panicked regret. They realize that they have missed their most fertile years. Some endure trauma and depression as they confront the fact that the family they always assumed that they would have simply cannot happen anymore. Feminist propaganda has saturated American and European culture, and while it has brought suffering to countless women, it has undeniably succeeded in one key area: reducing population across Western civilization. And this raises a disturbing question. Was feminism ever really about equality? Or was it, from the very start, simply a strategy to control the population? And consider this: overpopulation hysteria not only excuses, but it incentivizes the promotion of homosexuality and transgenderism. If you're gay, it's pretty unlikely that you're ever going to have kids. Worse still, it incentivizes the promotion of hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery for so-called transgender kids, resulting in the sterilization of children. So when a so-called transgender kid grows up and maybe they realize maybe they're not transgender after all and they want to try to have a normal life and get married and have kids, well, it's too late. The damage has already been done. These things all result in a reduction in world population. So overpopulation hysteria in the minds of some justifies all of these things. It justifies evil. This is the inevitable result of the atheist left's moral philosophy of the ends justify the means. Now, as I mentioned before, I don't think the original population control advocates were all sinister Bond villains stroking white cats. I think they genuinely believed that they were saving humanity. They thought that we were doomed to famine and extinction if we did not act. But they were wrong. They forgot to calculate human ingenuity into their equations. But instead of admitting this, they just double down. Even though the evidence today proves that overpopulation is not a serious problem, they can't drop it. They've just shifted the narrative from overpopulation to climate crisis, and they're still pushing the same destructive policies and catastrophic cultural changes. And look, to many people, this concern makes a lot of sense. Even to me, it kind of makes sense. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we live in a single planet with finite resources. But as I also mentioned before, the planet is vast. And human innovation seems always to rise to the occasion. Necessity really is the mother of invention. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Norman Borlaug and his agricultural innovations, high-yield crops, fertilizers, irrigation, they transformed farming worldwide. We can feed billions more today than we could have before 1950. Also, as nations grow wealthy and quality of life improves, the birth rate, as it turns out, naturally drops. And this is because industrial agriculture no longer requires large families to work the farm. Parents don't need extra income from their kids getting jobs. And better healthcare and reduced infant mortality eliminate the need to have tons of kids to ensure that some of them survive. All over the world, Japan, Italy, South Korea, as nations gain wealth, the birth rate collapses. And finally, there is a wild irony about climate change that nobody ever talks about. CO2 is plant food. Higher CO2 levels have actually led to some massive increases in vegetation. This is called global greening. Longer growing seasons, more crops, more food. Climate change, ironically, has helped us sustain more people, not fewer. So, but why? Why are NGOs and government bureaucrats still screaming about imminent planetary collapse? Because imminent planetary collapse causes fear. Fear equals control, and many of these people are addicted to control. As I mentioned before, Doge has discovered that many NGOs have become massive money laundering operations. Climate hysteria equals fear, fear equals more tax dollars equals more grift equals more political donations equal more power for the left. And again, it all comes down to control, money and control. So every time you see some climate change propaganda in a movie or a TV show or on the news, just remember that fear-mongering is really all about money and control. And now look what these psychopaths are doing. British scientists have just greenlit an experiment to block out the sun, and they're getting £50 million from the UK government to do it. They're calling it solar geoengineering. And it is insane. They want to spray chemicals in the atmosphere to reflect sunlight to cool the planet.
The British government has announced they're spending £50 million on experiments to dim the sun using chemical trails in the air to combat climate change.
That's British taxpayer money funding scientists to spray the sky with chemicals to block out sunlight. Sunlight, the reason all plants grow, the reason we can sustain life on this planet, and the UK government is messing around with an experiment to dim that sunlight. And what's truly infuriating about all of this is that if any scientist, any academic, any researcher dares question the settled science, they're done. Funding, careers destroyed. No debate allowed. And that's because, as I said, the narrative does not follow the science. The science follows the narrative. But there is a ray of hope. And once again, it's Elon Musk. While the climate alarmists are obsessed with slashing the global population, Elon Musk is out there saying the exact opposite. Musk's view? Humanity needs more people, not fewer. And he is absolutely right. Shrinking populations in places like Japan and Italy mean aging societies, collapsing economies, and overburdened pension systems. More people means more innovation, more productivity, more growth. More people means more minds to solve tough problems. Population booms, historically, have led to technological revolutions. Take the Industrial Revolution. Between 1750 and 1850, the population of Europe grew from about 140 million to 266 million. In the US, it went from 5 million to 23 million. Without young scientists and engineers, without more people, society stagnates. Overpopulation alarmists scream scarcity, but innovation has always solved these problems. Agriculture, energy, technology, it's all getting better every year. So look, humanity is not doomed. We do not need to be ruled by fear. We need to be ruled by reason. Stop worshiping at the altar of climate hysteria. Instead, go be happy, have a family, and take them to church. All right, well, that's it for me. Let me know what you guys think about all of this in the comments section below. And remember, it is not that our liberal friends are ignorant. It's just that they know so much that is not so. Good night.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.